So, as many of you know, I'm in my first semester of studying literature at the University of Vienna. And today I want to talk about what I have to study for my first exam in literature. Because I really wanted to know those things before I decided on studying literature. And I just find it very interesting in general to hear, what kind of makes a difference between someone who just loves reading in their free time and someone who studies literature. So today I'm gonna show you some of the tools we're getting to work with texts. Because my exam is coming up pretty soon. When you're watching this video, it's gonna be tomorrow. So before I get into the actual content, I just want to say a couple of words on this exam. So this exam is a combined exam of literature and comparative literature. So it's going to be 10 ECTS, if that tells you something, about 1/3 of what I have to study in this semester. And it's 2 introductory classes. And the problem with these introductory classes in language and literature is that often they have to cover such a broad base of things that it really doesn't go in a lot of depth with the topics. So these are not my favorite courses for exactly that reason. I really like my professors and they're doing their best to bring it across in the way that is most interesting. So really not complaining at all there, but just the sheer amount of topics that are covered, it's a little bit, I don't know, it's not my favorite. But when you study literature, you eventually must have heard about literary history, about how canons are made, about genres and things like that. So this tries to cover the base of all that, so that in other courses you can go more in depth. If you feel a little bit scared by what you see here, or that all seems like a little bit dry or theoretical or too abstract, I would just like to say that my other courses are not like that at all. And once you have some of those basics, those are the tools that enable you to go more in depth with other things. So it's not going to stay like that throughout probably your entire studies as well, if you do decide on studying literature. But I do have a friend and she studies Roman languages, and she told me up front, beware of those first 2 exams, because it's just gonna be a little bit dry. And they also use those exams to kind of like filter out a lot of people who might not be fitted to just learn theory and be able to apply it, basically. So anyways, I think my other video of what I have learned in my first month of literature is a lot more representative of the whole experience. So I would implore you to watch that as well. And I've made a playlist with all my study videos, so you can check that out if you want to. But now let's get into what I have to learn. So I'm gonna leave the timestamps down below, and it's the exam is gonna be, as I said, in 2 big parts. The first is on literature, which I'm gonna talk about first, and the second is on comparative literature, which I'm gonna talk about second. And the first course on literature, we talked about 8 or so main topics, and they're all going to be subject to the exam as well. So first we talked about literary history and how literary history is actually written. And we started with this quote by Lawrence Lipkin that says, "Literary history used to be impossible to write. Lately it has become much harder." Right? Which is like a bit of a paradox to say, because something that is already impossible cannot become even more impossible. But that was just the intro to tell us that it's incredibly difficult to write literary history. And basically what you do when you write literary history is that you draw connections between different texts. And there are different ways in which you can do that. So you can, for example, just focus on national literature of a country. You can focus on the literature of a certain language. You can focus on the connection between different epochs in history, or between institutions, for example, what has been in libraries, or you can draw connections between different authors. So it's always a question on what you focus on, because writing a very overall literary history of the entire world is going to be pretty much impossible. Because of the sheer amount of books that are written, you're going to have to cut out a lot. And the bigger your kind of domain is that you want to cover, the less representative it's going to be, because maybe you can then only choose one French writer that kind of has to represent the entire French history of writing literature, which of course is impossible. So we talked about these difficulties, and there are so many difficulties with the writing of history in general, and thereby also literary history, because when you collect and systematically order and review a bunch of books, for example, there's just a lot of difficulties you run into. For example, that different epochs are talked about very differently in different languages. So the Klassizismus, is something very different in German-speaking countries, like points to a different time in history than maybe, when we talk about classics in English, that is not necessarily an epoch always, right? So there's those kind of difficulties. But there are many reasons why you would go through the trouble and write literary history and care about it. And at the end of the 18th century, there came up this sense that literature actually preserves something of our culture in it, and that thereby it is worth sorting through and keeping to pass on. If you think about the fairy tales of the Grimm brothers, that is a huge piece of culture that we would not have if we would just let those fairy tales be in some bookshelf and never talk about them again. So you always want to ask yourself what is representative and what is worth preserving, basically also for the future. And it can help to create a sense of community around specific literary works. So maybe you're part of a minority in terms of the language you speak, for example, like Frisian in the Netherlands, right? So there, having a literary history and works to reference becomes really important, because those works give you a sense of belonging and justification in your language. So one of the questions we might get asked during the exam is why it has become even harder now to write literary history. And that is, of course, because of globalization. So language barriers are not so firm anymore. You can't really, when you write a national literary history of a country, do you count in all languages that are written there, or only the national languages? But of course, those people are influenced by other languages or other people, or they might have lived in different places. So that becomes very difficult. What also makes it difficult is that a lot of groups of people have been marginalized or forgotten in the past. Of course, the big one there would be simply women, right? If you look at a lot of literary history, it's mostly men most of the time. simply because women might have not had the means to write, to read, the time to read, or have not been promoted in the same way. But we're going to talk about that a little bit later as well. So basically there are many difficulties and many things to consider, and a lot of the topics that we cover in this course always kind of end at that point that it's really difficult, the borders are kind of blurry, and we just have to artificially erect some kind of borders to and communicate what we're even talking about. So that is the first topic. The second big topic we talked about was genres. And since my course is in German, and most of my studies, or like maybe half of it, is in German, we talked about the German genres of literature, which might be very different from the English one, right? If you think about English genres, you might think in terms of fictional texts and non-fictional, and maybe historical fiction, poetry, I don't know, like there's different ways to sort texts. And in German we have the three main genres, which are Lyrik, Epik and Dramatik. Lyrik, as it already says, it comes from texts that have been sung. Poetry counts as lyric. It's usually texts that have a deliberately beautiful language that is different from the language we use in everyday life. It's usually the narrator is just in the first person. So that's lyric. And then drama might be the easiest of them to recognize, is basically plays, right? Drama, where we get the content of the story by virtue of people talking to each other, like a Shakespeare play or a Goethe play, or anything like that. And then epic, see there, I'm not sure if it's the same way if you say epos in English or an epic in English, but epos basically means stories that are told, that are written usually in whole sentences, that have a narrator that is inside or outside the story. So your classic novel falls under that. I'm gonna go into a little bit more on that later. But that is the basic genres we're working with in German literature, and it's very much based on Aristotle, who said that these are the three natural genres, and Goethe sort of confirmed that, and that's still what we're working with today. So, and then all of these three genres kind of have very typical works of literature in them, and then they have works that kind of go towards the edge of being typical and bleeding into another one. And all of these genres have a history of their own, right? It then just gets very complicated again. And genres are, of course, very important for the communication amongst readers, but also from like bookshops to readers, right? If you go to a library or a bookshop, it makes a difference whether a book is under the poetry genre or under the historical fiction genre. So a genre kind of also works to awaken a sort of anticipation in the reader, and it's almost like a pact you and the author go into. When you know something is a novel, you know what to expect, basically, or at least a little bit, right? And then we also talked about books and genres that break this pact you have with the reader. As I said, Mouse by Art Spiegelman was one of those, where, the comic genre used to be just funny and for children and wouldn't talk about serious topics like the World War, and but he did, and that was like very upsetting to a lot of people. So one of the questions we might get at the exam is how Art Spiegelman broke the pact with the reader, and then go into some details of how that was received. The third topic is the big topic of the social history of writing and reading and circulating books. And the big question that we kind of have to ask ourselves there is, who writes what when, and who reads what when, and why, right? So literature, of course, is very closely intertwined with history and political and social things going on at the time in a certain place. So we cannot just assume, for example, that everyone had the means to even write. If we look at history, it has usually been the people that have been financially better off that are able to write, and disproportionately often it has also been men that were able to write and get their books published. In terms of reading, a lot of people were not able to even read not such a long time ago, actually. And so that makes that maybe other forms of literature were more popular, like the theater. And also in terms of circulation, how books are brought to people to read, that has changed a lot, right? And this chapter goes into all of that. And we read a wonderful piece of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own to demonstrate that problem, where she so famously says in the beginning that she wasn't allowed into a library because ladies are only admitted to the library if accompanied by a fellow of the college or furnished with a letter of introduction. So, that just tells you that there have been many inequalities of different kinds, and they're still there today to a certain extent. You could only write if you knew Latin many hundred years ago here in Europe. You could only write if you had access to paper and pens and ink, which was pretty rare as well. We also talked in this course about the different views we have as a society on authors and how that has changed. That we have many texts that are just written anonymously, where the author isn't important at all. Often authors are seen as like geniuses that are born with like a certain attribute or talent that not everyone has, and we kind of admire them and idealize everything about them, which is still the case a lot today. Another view is that writing is just something that can be learned, and if you just do it enough, you're gonna become very good at it. So it's a craft, it's a skill. And of course the political situation in a country has to be talked about as well. We talked about censorship, right? Propaganda, how if the people in power do not like a certain idea, they're probably not gonna support it and circulate it to a lot of different people, of course. And a question we might get asked is how Petrarca and Boccacino were responsible for getting Homer back on the syllabus, and that, much of why we read Homer today is thanks to them, because they found it important. They wanted to have it translated to Latin, and they had it back in the school syllabus in like 1300 something, 58 or something. and how all that went with the translation. And, it's these central figures and kind of off-chance moments that seem to determine so much of literary history and what we're reading today. The next big block and the next big lesson was about literature in general and what literature even is, and what falls under the term of literature and what doesn't. Because if you think about it, if you pick up a history book or a dictionary from your local library, is that literature for you? And if we think about it, we all probably have a different definition of what literature is to us, or what we think that literature is in the world out there. And again, there's no such thing as consensus on that. There are just attempts to kind of frame that category in a way that works for a lot of people. So we talked about, texts being fictional, that might be a criterion for literature, which of course has its problems again, because sometimes literature is also about real events, right? And real historical events and wars and things like that. Then if we say, literature is about a beautiful language, I think we all have counter-examples of language that is deliberately taken from everyday life to make a book more accessible. So does that not count as literature then? And what is beautiful language, Does it have to be archaic? So it's very frustrating to actually look for a term of literature and to kind of try to make it sound from all sides. It almost doesn't work. And if you look at Virginia Woolf's Orlando, for example, she didn't stick to the right genre there again, right? It says Orlando, a biography. So is it a biography? Well, it's not really a person that ever really lived. But what if it's written like a biography? So, it's just, the waters are so muddy, and really, it's incredibly frustrating. Because I feel like I'm learning all these things, but also then they don't really count or matter, or I'm not really able to communicate anything anyways. It just brings up a bunch of questions, a bunch of new questions, which I guess is a good mindset to get into, but it feels frustrating in the moment to not come to any kind of conclusion. So in the end, we kind of agreed to a term, or what we think literature is when we talk about it in class and in our studies. And it's a very complicated definition, but I'll try to translate it. So literature is an art form of language, form, or media that is communicated as a specific historical point under particular socio-cultural circumstances, and that is talked about then or something. I don't know. It's not so easy to translate. But yeah, I think I'm gonna just leave it at that. All right, in lesson number 5, we talked specifically about literary canons. And we started with these kind of scratchy poster you can buy on Amazon that says 99 books that you must have read, basically. And we looked at that a little bit closer, and the maybe problems with such a poster. Especially that it, for example, is centered much around European and American literature. It seems a little bit arbitrary. There doesn't seem to be a system behind it. It's also, again, mostly men. So yeah, that we kind of took that as an entry point into our discussion about literary canons. And then there come a whole bunch of complicated attempts to define literature in complicated German words, so I'm gonna spare you that. But again, when we think about canon, we have to think, who is making this canon, right? Is it a magazine? Is it someone who like studies literature? Is it a teacher who's making a canon for the school syllabus? Is it someone like me making videos on YouTube promoting certain books and not promoting other books? Because all that, in a sense, is forming a canon, right? Yeah, because canon making can happen in a lot of different forms. For example, we looked at some, Shakespeare t-shirts and Jane Austen little puppet figures. Of course, that communicates something, that we can buy these items but not other items. Or if you look at the Wiener Burgtheater, at the Büsten, the statues that are on there, right? You have to the left Calderon, Shakespeare, Molière. In the middle you have Lessing, Goethe and Schiller, and to the right you have Hebbel, Grillparzer and Friedrich Halm. Of course that communicates something. And of course there are many blind spots. Again, much of the things I've talked about before already. There are also different ways in which you can make a canon, right? You can ask yourself, are you making a canon based on aesthetic feature, right? So whether the style and the structure intrigues you of texts, what would your top 5 books be in that regard? You can also ask yourself, content-wise, which books thematically speak about topics that are important or morally important. You can also ask yourself, based on innovation, which texts are innovative and have been the first in a certain genre. I'm thinking Don Quixote, of course, which is supposedly the first novel we ever had. That we read Don Quixote today, but back then it was completely revolutionary to write that way. Or you can also, of course, ask yourself, which texts can you make good money with, or which have been sold a lot of times. So, it's just different angles to look at, and it becomes very difficult to talk about when we're not clear on what criteria we're basically applying. I mean, of course, you can do that in your own private life in whatever way you want. I'm speaking more in terms of having a nuanced discussion about it with other people. You have to be kind of clear what it is what your standards are in that regard. So a question we might get is how Nicole Seifert, who wrote Frauenliteratur, has mixed up a lot of those things with one another, and maybe hasn't paid enough attention to the historical context or like historical realities that were happening in the time that she's writing. So something like that. And then the last 3 big lessons were about lyric, drama and epic. So, the 3 main genres that we looked at before. We're kind of talking about them in a bit more depth with different examples and how to maybe recognize a text like that. And with lyric, a question we might get is to describe the history of the sonnet, what a Shakespearean sonnet is, how the sonnet has changed throughout the centuries, and some modern and postmodern attempts of, I guess, changing or absolving the sonnet genre. With drama, we talked about Medea. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Yeah, anyways, we talked about Medea and the different kind of adaptations of this play that has happened in different cultures throughout the centuries. We talked about how you can already, with the name of the cast, maybe interpret a lot of personality traits into characters, what the main text and the sort of theater instructions can tell you about a play, how to analyze people. I'm blanking a bit on all the English terminology, but and we'd also talked about the history of the theater, right? That it has not always been how it is now. That there has been like Wanderbühnen that didn't even have a fixed spot, but they were kind of traveling around. Yeah, and always again with that example of Euripides' Medea, that has been written 5 centuries before Christ, apparently, and has just seemed to be a text that we repeatedly want to watch and rewrite and do something with. Yeah, and then with Epik, which is like the genre of your typical novel, we talked about how you can analyze a text like that on different levels, right? You can think about the narrator and who is actually speaking, and whether that person knows more than the people in the story, is part of the story, knows equally as much, or knows less than the people in the story. You can analyze the duration of the whole thing, the frequency with which things are mentioned, the time in which it is written, the place in which it is written, and whether that might have like metaphorical relevance. Yeah, so a question we might get is that the teacher gives us a piece of text, and then we have to kind of gauge whether it is a Nullfokalisierung, whether it's a Nullfokalisierung, which means that the narrator knows more than the people in the story, or interne Fokalisierung, so aktorial, that means that the narrator knows as much as the people in the story, or externe Fokalisierung, so neutral, and the narrator knows less than the people, and he doesn't know the thoughts and feelings of the people in the story. I don't know. We still have another one on another lesson on that, so I'm not entirely confident on that subject yet, as you might be able to tell. But that is pretty much the gist of this first course. As I said, pretty, like, it's such a wide range of topics, and also just kind of unsatisfying things to think about because they cannot be pinned down. There doesn't seem to be some kind of answer to them, and it's just all very broad. But it is what it is. It's not very difficult to learn. Of course, there's a lot of jargon that I spared you, but it's really nothing too crazy. Let's go over to the comparative literature, which I personally enjoy a lot more. We also had to read a few books I will get into. And first of all, we talked about what comparative literature actually is. And we started with this definition that it is an examination of literary texts in more than one language through an investigation of contrast, analogy, provenance, and influence. And that definition is a little bit incomplete because we're also taking in other mediums, right? So in comparative literature, you kind of learn to look beyond language borders, but also beyond the borders of medium, and you compare texts with one another, which I think is absolutely lovely. because I personally, like, I love German literature, but I could not study only that. Yeah, and then we talked about the difference between the French and the American school of comparative literature, and that the French school is a lot more focused on, well, it emerged in 1899. The first university that offered comparative literature was opened in 1899 in Paris, and the French school of comparative literature has been very focused on influence, right? So have different authors read each other? If so, how has it influenced their work? And the American school of literature is not so interested in influence, but they're looking at structural similarities. So, for example, have theater plays at the time when Shakespeare wrote his theater plays. What did theater plays look like on the other side of the world? Is there maybe a structural similarity, even though these people probably never met? Have we just been at a certain stage of evolution in humanity that we talked about certain themes more or less? So that basically is the difference in a very, very rough few words, I would say. And that comparative literature was the first comparative studies at universities. Now there's also apparently comparative law and comparative medicine, where they aim to look at the differences in terms of, for example, medicine, how doctors treat certain things in different parts of the world, which I think is super interesting. Like, I would never study law, but comparative law actually sounds kind of interesting. And then there's just 9 main points that comparative literature deals with, so I'm just going to go over them quite quickly. First, it's literary history, then thematology, so that means which kinds of themes have been present in different texts. Rezeption, which deals with how works are received, right? Again, for example, Don Quixote was received very differently throughout the centuries. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. Then it deals with the question of genres. It deals with literary theory, literary translation. Of course, that is a big part. We talked about some wonderful examples of translation and how difficult it is to actually translate just the title of a book. And I'm planning actually to make a dedicated video about that, because I just found that hilarious and so revealing as well, because we do not realize how difficult translation is. Even if you're good at a couple of languages, try to actually translate a page of your favorite book. It's super difficult. Number 7 is Intertextuelle Hermeneutik. So that means the I guess study of stereotypes and whether those stereotypes hold true or not in literature. Intermediality, that's what I talked about before. For example, how have literary works been adapted to films, and things like that. So I think a possible question we might get is how Gyan de Satao, for example, has been translated in different languages, and whether those translations are still available or not, and why they were a success and why not, something like that. And then we went a little bit in depth on the questions of how works are received, works of literature are received. You can receive a book productively. I'm translating very roughly here, but if you read a book and then it inspires you to write another book, that is productive reading. if you read a book and then you want to write or say something about that book, like this YouTube video, or you're writing maybe for some kind of magazine or something, then that is a reproductive reading of the book. And you can also passively read that book. That means you just read it, basically. So, I don't know, then there's like a bunch of examples of that. We also talked a bit about Gustav Klimt and how he painted the ceilings of our university, and what a scandal that was, and how that was received, and again playing with that question of what do people expect and what do they get when they think about a certain genre, when they think about a certain artist. Things like that. And then we talked about what the difference is between an author and the narrator, and the fictional author and the fictional reader, and the real author, and the implied reader and the implied author. And yeah, we might get a question about the books we had to read, right? We had to read, for example, this book by Dröscher, Zeige deine Klasse, and I think he's gonna ask us to apply a lot of those theories that we learn in this course to the text, basically. So, he might ask what the difference between the author and the narrator is, or I don't know, something like that. Yeah, we read Address Unknown, which I love. You already know that from my other video, but I now have the book here, which, as you can see, is super slim. You can really read it. Like, this is the font. I don't know if you can actually see that. But if you need a small book to just read in like an hour, fantastic. I can really recommend it. So then we just had some examples of, for example, the theme of two lovers being in bed at night and someone warning them that the sun is going to come up and that they have to separate to not be caught. How that kind of similar structure of story has been found, in a text 6 centuries before Christ, and then like all the way through to Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare. There's German and Argentinian songs about these things. Bob Dylan wrote about it. Austrian singers and songwriters wrote about it, and we looked at a bunch of, like, we looked at a Bob Dylan song and those old texts and how it all kind of like overlaps, and what overlap, and how they dealt with the same theme differently, right? And that would be a very typical comparative literature question to ask yourself, where this theme can be found and what, maybe what that might mean. And then the next big subject we talked about in this course is how different books can be in dialogue with one another. So I already mentioned in my other video Palimpsest by Gérard Genette, and how he says that, most books are based on what came before them, and the different ways in which they can be based on something else is what we then talked about in class. So intertextuality, right? If like one text is present in another text with a quote, or someone's alluding to a theme that is actually from another book or something, that would be intertextuality. Paratextuality. Metatextuality is if you write a text, like a scientific text about another text. Hypertextuality is when you take over the content or the structure of another book, like famously Ulysses did take over the structure of Homer's Odyssey. Yeah, and we talked about Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, and that, you know, if you live in the UK, apparently you know what that is about, and it's a very important text, and that this pilgrimage to Canterbury, well, we talked a little bit about the story behind that and what people did and why they would go there, but then mostly we talked about how other texts took over that same kind of theme. For example, in T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, he starts in a very similar way as the Canterbury Tales, but the Canterbury Tales say that April is this beautiful month where everything comes back alive, and T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland says that April is the cruelest month, right? So it's a very dark turn on this whole subject as a whole. And then we also compared it to David Lodge's Small World, where suddenly literature students and professors don't go to pilgrimages for like spiritual reasons. They go to literary conferences in the spring, and he kind of makes fun of that parallel or something. Apparently it's a great book. But we kind of put all these texts side by side and like analyze them. The next bigger theme we talked about in this course is autobiographies and auto-fiction, and we talked a little bit about the history of autobiography, how it always used to be something for just very accomplished men, basically, and how for a long time it was very daunting to write an autobiography because it basically had to mean that you did something spectacular with your life. And, you know, people like Rousseau or Goethe would write autobiographies, and how autofiction, on the other hand, focused a lot more on the like mundane, everyday kind of struggles that people go through. And yeah, just we looked at different beginnings of, you know, Goethe's autobiography, which is very has this is very like Goethe just seems very self-confident in that. We looked at Augustinus' Confessions, which could be seen as the first autobiography. Just different texts. And then we looked at Annie Ernaux, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature a couple of years ago, and she went more into the autofiction direction. And yeah, we basically asked ourselves, are these authors aware of the fact that what they're writing is very subjective or not? Have they talked about that? What perspective are they taking? Things like that. And then the last lesson was all about Cervantes' Don Quixote, which we had to read, of course. Not all of it, as I said, but some of it. And we talked a lot about Cervantes and his life, and Shakespeare and his life, and how we know so little about Shakespeare and so much about Cervantes that it's very breathtaking. We talked about the influences for Don Quixote, what kind of genres were around at that time, and we also talked about how Don Quixote was received, and first seen as like something funny and entertaining, then as like a very socialist novel and other things, right? So we again also looked at translations and how it was first translated to German. It's hilarious. But that was like a whole long lecture on Don Quixote, which I very much enjoyed. I'm thinking about making a video about it, to be honest, with everything that I learned about Don Quixote and my reading experience with it and things like that. So yeah, that pretty much sums it up. This video has taken a lot longer than I thought it would. I hope it has not been too dry and you can imagine a little bit what it's about. I think it gives you an idea, honestly, it gives you an idea on what the introductory courses could be. Yeah, if you have any questions, let me know. Wish me luck for tomorrow. And yeah, I'm pretty confident it's gonna go all right, and I'm most of all just looking forward to going a lot more in depth with some of these topics, because overall I find it all quite interesting, right? And I didn't know most of these things, which is why I decided to learn all of that. So I'm very, very grateful for that. Yeah, I'm just also kind of glad when this first exam is over, and also when I know how I performed, because I haven't been in school in like 5 or 6 years. So yeah, but again, I think it's gonna be fine. Yeah, again, I'll link the playlist on all my study videos if you want to see them up here and in the description box. And thank you so much for watching. I will see you again very soon. I don't know if you have seen it, but it snowed for the first time in the city today, which is very exciting. So I think I'm gonna try and go outside a little bit now. Okay, thank you for watching, and bye bye.